I'm joined by Byron York. Good morning, Byron. How are you?
Good morning, Hugh. How are you?
Great. Byron, how long have you been doing journalism?
Oh, since the Clinton years.
And so, quite a while. Between the two of us, I think we've got 60 years at this business, right?
Oh, my God. Do we have to go into this?
We do,
right.
because I'm setting up a question with that backdrop. In these collective 60 years, I do not believe I have seen an episode as humiliating for a news platform as the New York Times last week with Tom Cotton. There was Dan Rathergate. There have been plagiarism issues like Janet Cook at the Washington Post, but those were errors by individual. This was a collective immolation. Agree or disagree?
I do agree. The thing that's going on now in newsrooms across the country, and especially at the New York Times, is that, I mean, how long have conservatives talked about what was happening on campus and radicalization on campus? Well, now the radicalized students from campus are working at the New York Times. And I think what you saw this week was that the senior people in charge of the New York Times, people who are experienced, who are in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, were afraid of their younger workforce. And so when their younger workforce said something that sounds preposterous to me, which is that Tom Cotton's op-ed made us feel unsafe, they went along with it, and they got rid of they attached this in crazy editor's note to the Cotton op-ed. Then they fired the op-ed editor, and then they reassigned the other senior editor who had worked on it. So, also, by the way, did you notice that Axios, the news organization, came out and announced that they support, it's okay for its employees to attend protests, and if they're arrested, Axios will pay their bail. This was an extraordinary thing in light of what happened at the New York Times, just another move toward completely abandoning the issue of fairness in journalism.
There is a liberal, small L, democracy approach to news and to opinion, which is based in John Stuart Mill's on liberty. Tom Cotton on Fox and Friends yesterday addressed this. I want to play and get your comment on this, Byron York. This is Senator Cotton yesterday morning, cut number 9.
It's amazing. It all started on this program just a week ago after the violence and looting that we saw in Washington, D.C., where a famous church was torched and our memorials were desecrated and businesses were looted. I said on your program last Monday that the National Guard needs to be called in, and if they can't back up police sufficiently enough to stop this anarchy on our streets, then the Insurrection Act provides the president with the final resort tool that he needs. Now, fortunately, more and more cities and states called in the National Guard through Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday of last week, and that was not necessary. But the New York Times actually asked me to explain in further detail that exact point I made. They even defended it. The publisher defended the decision to publish that column after it was published, and the mob in their newsroom began to demand that it be taken down, there be consequences. And within a day, it turned into something like a struggle session from the Cultural Revolution in Mao's China, where the adults had to prostrate themselves and apologize in front of the woke children that apparently now run the New York Times newsroom. And now you've had the opinion page editor have to resign. But let's be clear, this all goes back to the publisher and his unwillingness to stand up to a bunch of 20-year-olds and 30-year-olds who were raised on social justice seminars on our campuses. They need to behave like grown-ups, not like children who are confronted with an opinion that they don't like.
Now, Byron York, my only problem with what Senator Cotton said is he made an allusion to a struggle session in the Cultural Revolution, which, because of the historical amnesia of the current woke generation, will not be understood by them. Agree or disagree?
Well, there has been kind of a debate about how to characterize this kind of wokeness that's going on, and a lot of people do see it as more Maoist than other forms of totalitarianism, like the Soviet communism. You're right; they probably won't, but it's also kind of amusing to use that discussing the inner workings of the New York Times, which should be dedicated to the public's right to know.
Now, the next step, though, is for every woke young journalist, there is a woke young jurist in waiting for a Biden administration. In other words, if you give the judiciary to Joe Biden, you're going to get woke judges who make woke journalists look tame by comparison. Do you expect this to be a theme of the Trump campaign?
Oh, absolutely. Well, and the opposite is also the flip side of that is the positive side for the Trump campaign, which is that the president has nominated and confirmed 2 Supreme Court justices. How many appeals court?
51 thus far, and 2 more in the queue. Okay,
so an enormous number of appeals court justices, and if you elect Joe Biden, all that's going to stop. But, the president, I think a lot of conservatives believe one of the best things Donald Trump did was essentially farm out his judicial nomination process to the Federalist Society and working with them come up with a list during the campaign, because you remember there was a Supreme Court opening during the campaign in 2016, come up with a list and said, look, to elect the president, I'm going to nominate a candidate from this list. And then did it. Later expanded the list and nominated Brett Kavanaugh after that. So that was a big, big thing for Trump to gain the support of conservatives during the campaign, and it's something he has actually delivered on. And then the question is, why wouldn't Joe Biden do that from the other side? Because the Supreme Court brings out the same sort of emotional issues among deep blue Democratic voters that it does in mirror image among Republican voters.
Now, Byron, we have woke journalists, woke jurists in waiting. It appears like we have woke generals, but I know Jim Mattis, he's the opposite of woke. I just don't believe he's woke at all. But I do worry about Colin Powell in a statement that he made this weekend to Jake Tapper. I want to play it for you, cut number 20.
We have a Constitution, and we have to follow that Constitution. And the president's drifted away from it.
Stop. Full stop. The president has drifted away from the Constitution. I'm writing about this for the Washington Post today, Byron. Jake did not ask him about that. That's an astonishing, and it's an incorrect, and it is a wildly inaccurate statement.
Well, it's interesting. Obviously, Colin Powell became famous through his military service in the Bush White House, and service as Secretary of State. So he has, a very, very big and impressive resume, and that in Republican administrations. But judging by his public statements, I don't believe he's voted for a Republican for president since at least 2004. He voted for Obama in 2008 and in 2012, voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016, and now says he'll vote for Joe Biden in 2020. So I don't think it makes a lot of sense. If you're talking about presidential politics, I don't think it makes a lot of sense to call Colin Powell a Republican.
I agree,
anymore.
but I'm going to the substance of his statement that the president has drifted from the Constitution, which, if true, is a dire statement of fact. It's not true. He was not called on it by Jake Tapper. But do you think there is any basis for asserting that President Trump has drifted from the Constitution?
No, I think one of the things that's been striking about the president is that he is accused of authoritarianism, daily on the left. And we've seen this from the very beginning of his administration. He does something, a judge tells him to stop, and he stops. And that's kind of been the story. I mean, a lot of Trump policies have ended up in court, not because he enacted them over the rulings of a court, but because he was waiting for judicial review of whatever he had done. As a matter of fact, that has raised a longstanding issue. You know a lot more about this than I do. Of a single district judge somewhere issuing a nationwide injunction to stop a presidential action. But the fact is that the president has actually obeyed the courts, and
that's it, Byron.
What you're supposed to do.
The general is confusing an aesthetic critique with a constitutional one, and I see that everywhere. Do you agree with that?
No, it's very well put. I agree with that. Yes.
Byron, it's always good to have you on when you agree with me. Actually, it's good to have you on even when you disagree with me. But Byron York and I are really old, and we've seen a lot, but we've never seen anything like the collapse internally at the New York Times. I'll be right back. Thank you, Byron.